Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 6, the final game of the preseason for the San Jose Sharks as they took on the Vegas Golden Knights and won by a score of 6-5. And it was just yesterday that I was talking about how the preseason for the San Jose Sharks hadn't been particularly exciting up to this point. In the prior 5 games, outside of Macklin Celebrini, who has come exactly as advertised, the Sharks have been relatively mediocre at best, even in their victory against the Anaheim Ducks. And so coming into tonight's game, they were looking to build a little bit of momentum, a little bit of hype heading into the regular season in just a few days. And that's exactly what the Sharks actually managed to do. They were trailing in this game with 4 minutes left, down 5-3, and honestly 3 goals in comparison to the offensive output in some of their previous preseason games was actually not all that bad, but they were not done there. They managed 2 goals with the goaltender pulled to tie this game up at 5, and in seemingly a game that was destined for overtime play, it was Ethan Cardwell with just 12 seconds remaining who would get the go-ahead goal and put this one away in regulation 6-5. A come-from-behind victory against the Vegas Golden Knights, of all teams, not the first time that the Sharks have managed to do so, and it was made even more impressive by the fact of the roster difference between these two teams. The Sharks, because they played yesterday, ended up resting a lot of their bigger names players. No Eklund, no Toffoli, no Zetterlund, none of the sorts. Instead, it was a lineup filled with players either who didn't play yesterday, like Gaudreau and Cunnin, or players who are still vying for a lineup spot to start the season. On the other side of things, the Golden Knights were pretty much ready to go for the regular season. They've got Eichel, they've got Stone, they've got Hurdle, they've got Pietrangelo. Everybody who's anybody for Vegas was there ready to play. It's the preseason. You're not expecting an outstanding performance. You're not expecting them to be putting their best foot forward, and while the Sharks were slightly outplayed, or a decent bit outplayed here tonight, the fact that they still managed to come out on top when there was such a massive difference in terms of lineup strength is impressive nonetheless. Now, when it comes to talking about the lineup for San Jose, we will start off actually with the second line of Gushchin, Dellandrea, and Kostin, and this relates to a quote given by Ryan Warsofsky at the beginning of today when he was talking about the roster for the game, and he mentioned how it was going to be filled with players who would still be trying to earn a slot. And he actually mentioned a few players by name. Now, it was Cagnoni, Thompson, Cardwell, guys who you could argue are still looking to make an impact here with San Jose, but realistically they'll be heading back to the Barracuda within the next couple of days. But also he mentioned both Gushchin and Klim Kostin. But perhaps even more notable than that were the players that he didn't mention by name. In particular, Gaudreau, Cunnin, Grundstrom, and Dellandrea, because if we look at the Sharks' projected lineup to start the season, one could say that the top 6 is pretty much set in stone. Celebrini, Eklund, Toffoli, Granlund, Zetterlund, and Will Smith. The 3rd and 4th line center slots are also likely to be taken by both Wenberg and Nico Sturm, and so it is really the 4 wing slots in the bottom 6 that are up for grabs. And based on that quote that I mentioned, it seemed as though Gaudreau, Cunnin, Grundstrom, and Dellandrea were the 4 guys to beat for those positions, and that it would come down, if there was one slot available, between Gushchin and Kostin. So these 2 players on the same line were in a way going up against each other in a head-to-head to see who could be able to secure the perhaps one lineup spot that was available. And it is quite clear here who actually ended up coming up on top in that competition. You can't argue against Danil Gushchin, who didn't just have a point or 2 here tonight, or 3 or 4, but 5 assists. Most players don't even manage to get 5 assists in a game throughout their entire career. And while this is, of course, the preseason, it is still quite a notable achievement. An incredible offensive game for Danil Gushchin, and many of these assists were outstanding for him. On the first goal for Klim Kostin, it was a great pass. Usually when you think of these elite passes, you're thinking like behind the back or all the way across the ice. This was just a few feet, but with the amount of pressure on him from the Golden Knights defenseman, it was still an extremely slick pass. But it was actually the 6-on-5 situations that were perhaps even more impressive than that, as Gushchin was the play driver on all of those goals, on the couple of goals that they managed to score. And if we really want to look at the second one, it was Gushchin who wins a tough battle with Dorofeev to retrieve this puck, turn and fire it on net for Cunnin to actually tip it in to tie this game up at 5. If not for Gushchin, the Sharks are nowhere near competitive in this game here tonight against the Vegas Golden Knights. So it was a spectacular performance offensively. Now, was it a picture-perfect, pristine 10-on-10 performance? Maybe not necessarily. Defensively, a bit of work. Ryan Warsofsky has constantly talked about the small details that Gushchin needs to work on, but what player here could really say that there aren't small details for them to work on? There were many mistakes, even from the more veteran guys in the lineup, like Goodrow, like Cunnin, like Grundstrom, similar to what Gushchin had, and none of those guys managed to put up 5 assists. So realistically, this should be the stamp into the starting lineup for the San Jose Sharks. If it doesn't end up happening, that would probably be a horrific decision, one of the worst that we will have seen the Sharks make in a very, very long time. That's not even that much of an exaggeration. On the other side of things, we do have Klim Kostin. Like I said, he was trying to outperform Gushchin, and he obviously fell short pretty significantly. It actually goes back to something I mentioned at the beginning of the preseason when I made a video talking about what these young players actually had to do to earn a spot in the lineup. I mentioned Gushchin needed to have an offensive explosion here in the preseason, which is exactly what he did. And when it came to Klim Kostin, I mentioned amongst a couple of other things that he needed to remain disciplined. And here in this ultimate deciding game for his future for the San Jose Sharks, he took 2 minor penalties, and that seemed to be the nail in the coffin for Kostin's chances, as when it came to the 6-on-5 situation later in this game, an opportunity for him to be on the ice to help this team tie the game. Instead, the Sharks went with Goodrow, Wenberg, Cunnin, Cardwell, Cagnoni, and of course, Danil Gushchin as that extra forward. Kostin nowhere to be found in that situation. So indeed, it feels as though Gushchin has won this battle. When it comes to the final player on this line, we do have Ty Dellandrea, who was kind of serving as more of the calmer, defensively oriented player on this line. Warsofsky has been putting a significant amount of responsibility on Dellandrea in this game to be a reliable defensive player, and I actually thought he did a pretty decent job at that. So if there was someone that Gushchin was going to be beating out of the lineup, it probably wouldn't end up being Dellandrea, especially since he does have that center ability to be able to step in and take faceoffs, something of course teams absolutely love to have. When it comes to the first line, we have Goodrow, Wenberg, and Cunnin. Obviously not the most exceptional first line on paper, but they honestly did a pretty decent job. Now, they weren't really doing anything offensively, but they also were preventing a decent amount from actually happening on the defensive side of things, right? Really, it was a line that was on the ice, and nothing actually ended up happening all that much. We'll start off here with Luke Cunnin, who honestly has had a really solid preseason. Somewhat surprisingly, I'm obviously not the biggest fan of Cunnin as a player, but I have to admit that he's come out, he's played rather well in pretty much every single preseason game he has had, and again, like I said with Dellandrea, Gushchin is probably not going to be beating out Cunnin for that lineup spot. He will be beating up someone else who I will mention a little bit later. On the other side of things, we have Barclay Goodrow, and while he hasn't been nearly as impressive as Cunnin throughout this preseason, honestly, it feels as though he's kind of just been going through the motions a bit. Warsofsky is a big fan of Goodrow as a player, so he'll likely find himself in the starting lineup as well. Here tonight, he did have that breakaway, which was really the big moment offensively for him. Otherwise, really not much else happening. An average, maybe slightly below average game for him. And the same would have to go for Alex Wenberg, who didn't really make much happen offensively. He wasn't necessarily working with the most skilled offensive players in the world either. And so it was a average to below average game for him as well. Then we move on to the third line, where we have Grundstrom, Sturm, and Colin Graf. And we shall start off with Carl Grundstrom, who it does seem to be the player who will lose his lineup spot for Danil Gushchin if I was a betting man. It just doesn't really seem to be in the cards for him. I did sing his praises yesterday, sort of, when I talked about his tenacity on the forecheck and him being an okay fourth liner in the future for the San Jose Sharks this season. But this game, there were a couple of mistakes, in particular on that first Vegas Golden Knights goal. He was in complete no man's land watching the puck, which was just really, really ugly to see. So that was a major mistake here tonight. There really weren't many bright spots for him. And so a player who has come in and has had multiple games in which he has been nothing better than mediocre, it's hard to say that he's actually managed to win out in a lineup spot compared to Gushchin, who's got like 10 points thus far in this preseason. When it comes to the other two players on this line, we'll go next with Colin Graf, who had a really, really strong start to this game. His first period, he was one of the Sharks' better forwards. He had some great offensive zone shifts, really making some nice plays happen. It even kind of created this thought in the back of your mind that, like, hey, could he make like a late push to actually being able to make the lineup? But then as this wore on, the second period he was still okay, but the third period he was pretty much invisible, and so I don't think he ended up actually making that push, but it was not a terrible game for Graf, certainly. And then when it comes to Nico Sturm, kind of like with Ty Dellandrea, was relied on defensively, did some decent things there, and is likely penciled in for a lineup spot anyhow. When it comes to the fourth line, we have Giovanni Smith, Colin White, and then of course Ethan Cardwell. We'll start off of course with Cardwell, who not only had the game winner here tonight to make it 6-5 in the last few seconds, but he was relied on in the 6-on-5 situation by Ryan Warsofsky, which shows a good amount of confidence with him. The Sharks could have gone with Dellandrea, they could have gone with Klim Kostin, but instead they go with the young Ethan Cardwell. And while I mentioned that he will be heading back to the Barracuda almost certainly within the next day or two, it builds up a significant amount of hope in him as a Sharks prospect that he could become a good player in the NHL. We saw a couple of awkward moments defensively, kind of like what we saw with Cutter Gauthier against in that 1v1 between him and Cardwell on that Gauthier goal yesterday, but we also saw some decent defensive plays as well. A solid game for sure from Cardwell. When it comes to the other two players here, I actually once again was a fan of Giovanni Smith. It actually reminds me of last preseason for the Sharks, where he also was quite good then, but then when he actually got the time in the regular season, he just completely fell off a cliff. I don't think he'll actually still be given the chance. It just doesn't feel as though there's room in the lineup for Smith. But if he's like a 14th or 15th forward, I really wouldn't hate it that much. And then when it comes to Colin White, he was mostly just kind of called up here to be a warm body in the lineup. No offense to him, and I don't think he was terrible here tonight, but it's not the most notable player in the lineup. On the defensive side of things, we still had a few defensemen filling out the spots here that did play yesterday. So for instance, on this top pairing, we got Thrun and Ruda. They were two of the better defensemen for the Sharks in the previous game, and I thought that kind of continued here tonight. Ruda was maybe slightly worse than he has been in the past, but he did get some tough matchups against a really NHL-ready Vegas squad. And then when it comes to Henry Thrun, I actually thought he was one of the better defensemen, and I've really been enjoying these kind of offensive excursions that Thrun has been having in the offensive zone at times over these last couple of games. Seems to really be pushing to try and be more of an offensive defenseman thus far in this preseason. We shall see if that can carry over into the regular season. On the second line, we have Ferraro and Thompson, and I want to focus a bit onto Mario Ferraro, because I have mentioned time and time again, this will probably be like the 10th time at this point over these preseason videos, that these established players, they're not exactly giving it their all. And yet, when I think of Mario Ferraro as a person, he's always someone who seems to be given 110% of his effort. In the preseason, maybe it's not quite at that level, but I imagine he's that type of personality who really still wants to win, who really still wants to try, which makes me a slight bit nervous through this preseason, because Ferraro really hasn't been all that great at all. In fact, he's been kind of bad in a lot of the games that he has played. And this is somewhat disappointing, because last year, while the Sharks as a whole were a really, really bad team, Ferraro was kind of like a lone, somewhat bright spot where his stats actually were not all that bad in comparison, at least to his previous 3 years before that. And so going into this season, when the Sharks were hopefully going to be a little bit better on the ice, Ferraro would hopefully be able to carry that improvement forward. Preseason, of course, you're not going to take any sweeping conclusions here. It is very possible that Ferraro will really pick up his game once the season actually does start. But like I said, personality-wise, for how I read Ferraro as a player, for him to be struggling this much in preseason, maybe it won't bode well heading in against St. Louis in just a few days from now. When it comes to his defensive partner, Jack Thompson, also not the greatest night for him. I liked some of the things he was doing somewhat offensively, but defensively defensively, he certainly had a couple of issues. On the third defensive pairing, this is where we featured Luca Cagnoni. Like I mentioned earlier on, Warsofsky said he was still technically in the running for a lineup spot, but that's not really the case. We know he's going to be heading back to the San Jose Barracuda within these next couple of days, but this was like that one last opportunity to show what he actually has here in the tank, and I thought it was a decent night for Luca Cagnoni. Very, very up and down for sure. There were definitely some issues in the defensive zone that made you think that there were clearly some kinks that still need to be worked out in his game. But what I really liked was his work in the offensive zone, in particular in the 6-on-5 situation, being that defenseman who is relied on. Considering when you take a look at the Sharks' starting defensive roster for going into this season of Wallman, Ruda, Ceci, Ferraro, Thrun, there's not a lot of really big offensive guys there. There's not a lot of players who are going to be carrying the torch over these next 3 to 4 years from an offensive perspective. I talked about Thrun trying to take strides in that way, but he's still nowhere near close. So the fact that Cagnoni seems to be that big name offensive defenseman in the Sharks system currently, and he's managing to show that off still so early on in his career, is a really big bright spot moving forward. And then when it comes to his defensive partner Schultz, I thought he had a decent start to this game, but there were a few too many shifts as well where he struggled. Still kind of like with Colin White, bit more of a warm body to fill out the rest of this defensive pairing for the Sharks, so not super notable. And then when it comes to the goaltender tonight, Mackenzie Blackwood, it was it was an okay game, I guess. Obviously, he lets in 5 goals. That's never going to look good on paper. But the Golden Knights, they iced a very competitive roster. They had some great chances. The Sharks fell apart a bit defensively at multiple different occasions. And so Blackwood, a lot of these goals, he really didn't have that much of a chance on. So it's hard to put too much blame on him. However, in comparison to yesterday, where we saw Vanacek let in just 2 goals against an equally tough Anaheim Ducks team, it's very possible that Vanacek may have won the starting net, at least for Game 1 of the regular season. But that will do it for this review. The preseason is finally over. We can get away from having to watch these incredibly poor quality streams of which are randomly cutting away from the game and showing us random graphics of nonsense from the Vegas Jumbotron, and actually get to some more serious type of hockey moving into that regular season that starts on Thursday against the St. Louis Blues. And like I said, finally a game that will help build some momentum heading into that. The Sharks should hopefully be fully healthy there. Celebrini in, Granlund in, and we'll see how they can start it off. Class dismissed.